Man, Black Lives Matter, white supremacy, white privilege, blackout day, white guilt, and more race language. We're going to cover all that today on and look at the problems that it causes in our edition of the Wayne Carlin Show. So let's do it. Once again, we want to welcome you to our version of the things we think you need to know. And that's why we call it the Wayne Carlin Show. So I'm Wayne, coming all the way from the West Coast of California.
And I'm Carlin, coming to you from the Gulf Coast, better known as the great state of Texas. And we want to entertain you today with our Wayne Carlin Show, where we've got the problem with a racial approach. And we think we've got some issues out there that need to be resolved in our society. And we think that some of the solutions are not going to work based on our historical reference. So we want to come to you today with the problems, some of the problems we think that will happen with our racial approach in our society today. All right. So before we get going with that part of the show, though, we want Wayne to bring us up to date on some of the related issues that have happened out there in our society. So, Wayne, what else we got going on out there?
Wow, man. The 4th of July was a crazy weekend. We had I don't know if you noticed that we had an attempted lynching. The victim of this event is what he called it. He was accosted by 4 or 5 individuals who had it pinned up against a tree, and they were yelling at him and berating him and calling him names, racial slurs.
What state was that in? Where was that?
Oh, I should have done a little bit more research. I think it was Georgia, but I have to double check that for you.
Okay.
And his friends came to his aid. He was there with some other friends, and instead of leaving him, they stayed there with him. And even one of the bad guy's daughter, she was recorded, telling her dad and his friends to leave this man alone. So eventually and one of the things that was said in this event was, get the rope. So they actually made, innuendos like that, more than just innuendos. So anyway, the FBI is investigating it now, and they're looking at a hate crime event and seeing if they're going to charge it. There's videos out there about the whole incident. It was wild. Also this weekend we had, unfortunately, several young children. Now the newspaper and social media seemed to sensationalize it and brought out the fact that they were all African-American kids. And I had some people come back at me and say, well, were there any other children that were killed this weekend as well? And so I understand their point, but still, it was bad. The rate of violence, it was just out of control this weekend. We had 6 young children that I know of that died at gun violence, And then the last thing we were talking about, just yesterday here across the country, we had what was considered a blackout day. And that was a day where you weren't supposed to spend, if you're a descendant of African-American, you're not supposed to spend any money outside of, the community or outside of anyone who owns a Black business. And I know some people were for that. A lot of people were against it. Me, I understand, and you too, we understand historically the benefits of boycotts and how it was able to get certain business owners to change their way of thinking and to change the tide the way things were going. So I'm waiting to see what if there was anything significant that came out of yesterday. So those are some of the things that have been happening over the weekend.
Yeah, and the problem, and I'm glad we're having this topic today, the problems with the racial approach, because most all of those things have that racial aspect. As pretty much anything in our country has a racial aspect to it. And so that's one of the reasons we have this race concept happening. And so it's perfectly set up for our show today. And so before I get finished with our show today, we want to remind you that this is going to be some educational stuff out here today, educational and informative. And we're going to try to provide you more depth on it at a later source, because this is a 30-minute show we've got here. So we'll have about 20 minutes to try to cover some really deep topics. And we think topics that you will need to explore more on your own, but we'll provide you a video format where you can do that. And so we'll talk about that again at the end of the show. So let's get into the problems we think that we have with a racial approach. What we've got in our society now, of course, is a very racial atmosphere because of what happened with George Floyd. And that's not bad that it brought that up, because this is definitely something that has been a pain to the American psyche for a long time. And so what we need to do is we need to address it. However, addressing it in any old fashion either can leave us with very good solutions, viable solutions that can make change, or it can leave us in a circular, what I call the carousel effect, where we keep going around and around with the same old thing that's been going on. Because we've had race issues ever since, of course, even before the inception of slavery, we were kind of set up to have race issues. And so through our history, we've evolved in this whole thing, but nevertheless, always having racial issues. And so what we're experiencing today, the euphoria we're feeling in our society that maybe this is an opportunity for us to make change, is probably equaled by some of the other things that have happened in our history. In 1954, we had Brown versus the Board of Education that broke down the Plessy versus Ferguson decision that happened in 1896, and we felt like a change was coming. We had the Little Rock school integration, public school integration that happened in 1957. And once again, this was the first time when, quote unquote, Black people actually felt like a government was on their side, because they forced the integration and they had their federal marshals there to do that. Then we had the 1963 Birmingham incident with Bull Connor, when the dogs and the fire hoses were brought out and they turned them on kids. And everybody said, this is a watershed moment. And it was such a watershed moment that you had Lyndon Johnson and people come on afterwards and say, and use the theme, "We shall overcome," which was the theme of the movement at the time. We had the 1964 Civil Rights Act, 1965 Voting Rights Act. We've had all these great things that have happened. And George Floyd could be another one of those events. And we could go back to our racial ways in our country if we don't do the right thing and come up with very good solutions. So we're going to talk about the problems with some of the solutions that we've had. We'll talk about things that we should not be doing as we go forward. And so we'll start out today by saying that the first one is, and we've got 5 of these. So if you're keeping score, we got 5 of these. And like I said, we'll provide more in-depth discussion on these via video format and via some of our blog posts in future days. So if you're not getting them all now, just stay with us, because it's going to take some time to get this, to unwash those brains that have been brainwashed over the years with some of these ideas on race. All right. So let's start with the first one. And the first one is this is the reason that a racial approach will not work for what's ailing us right now in our country. The first one is the problem with the concept of race itself. All right. We all know, and we should know, and if you don't know, you can ask us, we'll tell you. We now know that race was a man-made social construct.
Right.
All right. So in other words, this was created by man for some purpose. And so how did this happen? Well, there was an evolution. And to take you through it in a brief, and this takes a lot of research, but I'm going to give it to you in 30, 40 seconds and talk about the evolution. The evolution began, of course, and they would say with 1619, but you had different people groups, of course, way before that. But the first time we had the introduction of African slaves along with indentured servants was 1619. Okay, so in that was 20 African slaves came over, and then there were a lot of indentured servants on that same vessel. Okay, so think about that. All right, so you got these people, African slaves along with indentured servants, and these people were kind of working together, although different contracts, but they had varying contracts. You might be amazed to find out that some of the slaves early were able to gain their freedom just as indentured servants, and that happened. But nevertheless, that evolved, and eventually you got the Enlightenment, which happened in the 18th century, so the 1700s. So remember, America's not even founded yet, and you've got these German and all these European scientists, German, Swedish, and French. They come up with these ideas of classification. And so just as they had begun to classify animals, they were now classifying human beings and saying there's this breakdown of human beings. You've got these, what they call Caucasoid, you got Mongoloid, and you got all these breakdowns. Some of them had 3 classifications, some of them had 5, but these were all scientists from the Enlightenment period. And they came up with these great ideas of how to classify human beings. So we didn't still have the concept of race. We had the concept of others and people. And now when they did this in the Enlightenment, they began to ascribe subjective views on this particular group. In other words, they said things like, those at the bottom, which they placed the Africans down at the bottom, they said they're lazy, they're this and they're that. Very subjective views. There's nothing scientific about that, because all their scientific, the creation of this taxonomy, which they were so proud of, we can now create this hierarchy or this stratification of people groups. They were proud of that. But then they got way out of science and started injecting their subjective and their opinionated views on what the groups were like. Now, amazingly, when this Enlightenment happened, remember, it was all of Europe. And so you had French, Swedish, and German scientists doing this. Amazingly, even when they created theirs, they separated themselves out as being like the French said, well, the French were the most enlightened. They were more enlightened than the Germans. And the Germans said the Germans were most enlightened. So that's just the human ability to say, I'm better than you are, I'm different than you are, but I'm better than you. And so you had this classification theory. And this is the thing that was getting ready to take on give race a whole new meaning, because you had this classification. Because remember, 1776, in this founding of this new country, we had a revenue-based economy built on that farming. All right. And so we had these people out there farming. How are we going to keep that when we create this country? And so that kind of is where we evolved into this race thing.
Wow, that's pretty deep. So how would you say, or what impact did that whole group classification thing have on what we know today as race?
Well, the biggest thing is because we kept it. We kept exactly what happened there. So we kept those views. And not only that, we began to build upon those views, because after the Enlightenment period and all of the European scientists, giving us all this new information, next was American scientists. And so now you're the late 18th century and you got the American scientists, Samuel Morton, Josiah Nott. These people came in and started doing things. They created this thing called craniometry. They were measuring skulls and saying, if you had a bigger skull, then you were more advanced or whatever. And so they made the Caucasians then have more advanced because of their skull size and things like that. And so this was what happened, that we kept all that stuff that was false information, the subjective stuff from the science. And then we began to build other things on that. You got the eugenics movement that happened in America too, the eugenics. And so you have that happening now, where they're saying certain people are less developed and those people need to be done away with in our society. So you mix that up with this classification scheme, then you realize why the people at the top had this low view of races and certain races. And then what happens after that? It goes back, and now those European scientists, and such as people like Adolf Hitler in Germany, is looking what the Americans are saying, and he's taking the stuff that we have and saying, oh, wow, so there is a superior race, because that was the stuff that Americans began to develop after the European scientists. So we got this back and forth where it's just getting worse and worse and it's scaling up. And so that's where we end up with this whole racial idea, and so all that's supported.
Why didn't all that go away after slavery ended in the 1800s, in the late 1800s?
Yeah. Oh, because it was so ingrained. And the biggest one is the two biggest things would be economics and hate. So you get economics and hate. You got the economics because, remember, the South fought to maintain more than anything the institution of slavery, because it was the basis of their economy. And they really felt like, wow, if they go away, we lose our free labor. It's kind of like me. I owned a barbecue restaurant. If I didn't have to pay for labor, that would have been a boom for me, And so so that's the dollar. And I hate to say this because I'm pro-capitalist, but it's just the dollar, and so the southern states were making it seem like as though, no, we can't lose this because we lose our whole existence. And that's the way they felt, because they would have had to change the way that they were doing business. So that was the economics part of it. But then the other part of it was because of the brutalities of slavery that had existed then, and now these people are free. I do think there was a lot of fear that if these people are free, and there's a lot of these people, I'm kind of worried about that. And so there began to be this hate. And so you saw the evolution then of the Ku Klux Klan and things like this. And that was purely hate. They didn't care economics, anything else. Some of the Klan members, they cared only about the hate that they had for this other group of people. So you got the economics, you got the hate. Both of those things are at play at this point. So that's it. So that covers a lot. And that's all that stuff is just simply talking about the concept of race and
Right.
how we got to where we are in our society today. A lot of that stuff is still there, but then there's some other reasons why a racial approach doesn't work. And so we'll cover those. And the next one would be number two, we stay inside the race paradigm. All those things I just talked about, we have doubled down on those things. And I think in a lot of ways, even in the things that we're talking about today, solutions that we're talking about to George Floyd are really ways for us to double down on the concept of race. It makes it very easy for us to make decisions about groups of people. So we kind of are comfortable with that. We're comfortable with saying white people, black church, black community, white community, blackout day. Those concepts are all things that are inside of the race paradigm, and we become very comfortable with that. There's an idea this guy had in 1954 talking about comparison theory, where we have an innate desire to compare ourselves to others. And so you throw that in there where we look at what happens out in our society, and we keep everything by race. We do education statistics, law enforcement statistics, wealth and poverty statistics, everything. We use these race comparisons. I mean, even when you think about sports, we say things like black people play basketball better and white people play golf better or something like that, of course, until Tiger Woods. We got all these things. So we have all these ideas ingrained in our psyche that are all things that are just taught to us by our culture as we grow older. And so those are the kind of things that keep us inside of the race paradigm and keep us from being able to get solutions that are outside of the race paradigm, which may be more enduring and long-term and actually solve some of the problems that we've got. You know, you can think about something as simple as we say skin color is just skin color and it's superficial. Only I would say that. Everybody else would say, no, it means something because it means something to other people. The issue is, what does it mean to you? And I think all of us don't understand. Most of us don't understand that society did that to us. Our culture did that to us. It made us believe that our skin color had so much more meaning, so that some people cannot be extricated from that. They can't be pulled away from that, that you can't take that from them because you're taking their very livelihood if you take that away. Can you imagine what if we did the same thing with something like hair color or eye color? What if BLM meant blue eyes lives matter? What if we had a concept where everybody with blue eyes, that was it? You know, and we separated people based on eye color. We would think that was ridiculous, but we do the same thing with skin color, which is just as superficial as your eye color. It's all, yep, it's determined by the genes. So is your skin color. It's determined by your genes. But yeah, but it doesn't have meaning for anything else. That's because we haven't given blue eyes meaning in our society. We do it with skin color though. And so that's what's got to be fixed. It's been in this paradigm for almost 400 years. We've got to get out of that race paradigm. That's our issue. All right, so let's go to the third one as we go through these. All right, the third thing is the reason why you can't use a racial approach, because race and that concept, as we talked about before, we talked about how race creates a hierarchy. In reading Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, she uses this term called, in America, we've created a racial caste system. And if you know about the caste systems of India, where caste systems are most popular, it's based on your class. And some people are born into a lower class, some in a higher class. Well, she says we've created a racial caste system here in America. In reality, race itself is a caste system. That's what's created in the stratified levels. Remember, we talked about the European scientists when they created this taxonomy, and they had Caucasians at the top, Africans at the bottom. That's already there. And that's what most Americans don't understand. That is built in to the concept of race. So you don't need to say racial caste system. You said it when you said race. That's why we got to get rid of race, because it's going to it always creates that imbalance. They're on the top, we're on the bottom, what I call the relationship imbalance. And so that's the issue, because you cannot have the victim and the oppressor ever equal. They never will be. And if you've got race as the concept, then you're talking about an imbalance there, because you're talking about a caste system where one's at the top, one's at the bottom, and they can never be equal. And great relationships, which is what I think the problem is in our country, relationships start with an equality that people have to have. We talk about all men are created equal, but we don't live that when we live the concept of race. That is a contradiction to the very principle that we were founded upon, that all men are created equal. We institute race. Well, you just nullified what you said. And that's why our country has been at odds with itself ever since its founding. All right. So racial imbalance. All right.
So then I hear what you're saying. How do we change the way people view each other?
And that hits at the crux of what the erase race movement solutions are. People think this is kind of like simplistic, and it really is, because we say that the answer really is relationship development. The answer to beating out stereotypes and generalizations about people of another race is simply for each of us to know each other, to know people in other groups. And that takes work. And that's why it hasn't been done. Most of our communities today are largely segregated. You've got some institutions that have done a great job of integrating. And where you find those institutions, you find less of the problem of this race thing that we're talking about. And so that's the issue. Our answer is simply to know each other, to start meeting people outside of ourselves and really getting to know them. I always say, not just knowing them, because that's one step, but to share life with them. And that's what's got to happen. So that's the really answer to how we go forward and make something more beneficial happen. We got to know each other. All right. So the fourth problem with the using the racial approach is that it creates this monologue instead of the dialogue that's necessary. Just as we talked about getting to know each other, there's something, and I'm hearing this a lot on the news. People are getting their quote unquote Black friends and saying, tell me about your experience. I didn't know this. I didn't understand that. Well, if you had been in a relationship with me, you would know that. And it goes both ways. If we had endeavored in relationships with people that are not like us, then we can empathize and we can understand their experience. But anytime we say we can't understand their experience or we don't know their experience, it's strange to me. It's because we haven't been in deep enough relationship. And when we're not in deep relationship, then we stand up and we talk from a singular viewpoint, which is the one that we have. And we do what I call a monologue. We tell people, well, this is what I think. This is what I think. And we don't wait to listen to how the people respond to the way that we're thinking. We don't want to hear their view. We're simply giving our view. That's what you get on these social media platforms these days. You get people out there who are just ready to lay out their side, and they lay it out. And then they say, and if you don't accept this, you can unfriend me. Well, that doesn't sound like that's someone who wants to entertain what you have to say. I don't want to hear what you have to say. I want to lay mine out there. I want to cut you with this knife and walk away. That is not beneficial to our society. And race does that because it creates this platform from which I stand with my viewpoint, and I don't really want to hear you. So we have monologue instead of the dialogue that's necessary. So that's something that's going to be very valuable if we can go forward with dialogue instead of monologue. And then we'll get down to our very final one. If we're going to go get rid of the racial approach to solving our problems in this country, we're going to have real solutions and not the cliches that we're using right now. And that's going to be very important because these cliches, and I keep hearing this cliche that's being used out there now, where they say it's not enough for you to be non-racist. You need to be anti-racist. Now, if we thought about that, if we had a conversation and talked about that, then everybody would understand how ridiculous a statement that is. But when it's thrown out there in the middle of a discussion with other things, everybody goes, yeah, that's right. Yeah, you need to be anti-racist, not just non-racist. Well, think about that. What if everybody was non-racist? We would have no need to be anti-racist. All right. So we just throw stuff out like that. It's not enough. Sure it is, because it means your individual portion is, I am going to see people as people, and I'm going to live that way. You don't have to go stand on a block. You don't have to go hold a sign. You don't have to do any protest. You don't have to do any of that stuff. You have to learn to treat people with dignity and respect because they are human beings made in the image of God. That will be enough. And for people to tell you now that's not enough, well, that means they're throwing away viable solutions. And so we've got to get rid of the cliches. I mean, because at the end of the day, other things like Black Lives Matter or All Lives Matter or Blue Lives Matter, all those things become distractions from real solutions because they become cliche. Not to say it doesn't mean that they all have some valid meaning, but when they become cliche, they can distract us from real solutions, the human solutions that are going to bring about the answers. You know, when people use, I mean, even terms like social justice or white privilege, we're so racialized that we take basic terms and we color them. Privilege is a concept that works across the board, but we've taken that concept and we've colored it. So we call it white privilege. You know, why? Because that fits inside of the racial paradigm. So we're stuck inside of the racial paradigm and we're going to color everything because we're stuck on this concept of race. So we've got a lot of work to do. Like I said, we can talk more about these things and we're going to have some opportunities to do that as we expound upon some of these things in some educational and informational videos coming forward from Erase Races. So stay tuned to our eraseraces.com website for that. And you'll get a lot more education. And we'll discuss these because when I talk about these things, I also talk about them in the sense that I'm willing to hear the other side and hear other views, because I think my view is that we have taken up on this racing and we don't know how to get rid of it. We've got race in our society and we don't know how to get rid of it. And I think that it's going to be an individual act where we all begin to just know each other and we get away from white, black, and anything else that puts people on the sideline because they don't belong in our group. So a lot of work to do.
Yeah,
Wayne,
man, that's a lot of information. I actually asked a question on social media last night about the whole white, black. Why is that so prominent? And even brown, we hear that a lot, but we never hear red. We never hear yellow, and some people responding to it. Some people are like, well, because it wasn't widely accepted. It's some other reasons behind that too. So where else can people get some more of this information though? Because this is good stuff.
Hey, really good. Hey, go ahead and check out our YouTube channel and our Facebook page. We've got forums that we've been hosting. And in those forums, you hear diverse thought, because one of the things I'm into hearing opposing views. I love hearing opposing views because I want to hear what people on the other side have to say when I talk about simple things such as let's get rid of talking about skin color and let's talk about human beings. And so I'm often wondering, why would anybody be opposed to that? Because in my mind, I can imagine that, but they have valid questions about how do you just go about getting rid of this race concept. And I understand that. And I think it's through that dialogue that I talked about earlier. It's through that dialogue that you all become more informed. So look for more of our forums. And also, there's a lot of other people who are holding forums such as ours out on the internet. And you can find some of those. When you go and you review some of those forums or listen to them or watch them, ask some of these basic questions. Does that take us out of the racial paradigm, or does that keep us inside the race paradigm? Am I more likely to see people as human beings, or I'm more likely to see them as black or white or other? So those are things you can do, because I think it's going to be through the education and the relationships that we develop that are going to give us solutions to what ails America right now. So go out and do that, and we can make the change that needs to happen in our country. That's what we're devoted to here at Erase Races. We look forward to the opportunity. And while some people are saying, I am tired, we're not tired here at Erase Races. This is what we do, and we're ready for the work, rolling up our sleeves, and we're getting to it. So thank you for joining us today. We've got some fundraising coming up in the future, and my director, Maria, is going to be mad that I didn't talk more about it. But really, I want to get the ideology, and you'll give. I know once you get the ideology and you find out what we're up to, then you'll give. So we're going to hit you with some fundraising pitches later on this week. So be attuned to that. I want to thank you for supporting us here at Erase Race. This is Carlen.
I'm Wayne.
And we're saying we're out. Thanks for joining us today.